Alright, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out, you guys. I'm sure there's probably a lot of you that already heard about this story. You might have heard bits and pieces about it, but since I did my research and I heard some of the details that were involved in this story, I knew I had to run something on it. The other reason why I wanted to run this story is because there's been a lot of speculation about why this happened, what was involved, and some of the intricate details behind it. Nobody's put the true factual story out, and that's probably because they don't know. Anyways, before I get into the actual details of what happened and who was involved, there's a few things I want to say because I want to make sure that I premise this right for you guys. So I titled this story The Devil's Playground because, for one, based on the circumstances, I think it's befitting, and for two, once you guys hear the details, I think you guys will understand why. You know, I sure wish YouTube didn't have such strict policies and guidelines because I actually have the video of this incident and I would just show you guys the footage. But the video is way too graphic and there's no way YouTube would ever allow me to show it. So unfortunately, after I give you guys the backstory, I'm gonna have to walk you through the video and give you a step-by-step description of what happened. Anyways, when I first watched this video right after this incident happened, a couple of things came to my mind. And one of the main things is something that I said in one of my recent videos that I titled, California Considers Bringing Back the Shoe. And one of the points that I tried to emphasize throughout that video is that the California state prison system has completely lost control of its own system and that the homicide rate is on pace to continue breaking its own yearly record. You know, I understand that the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation was under a lot of pressure to honor some of the rulings that were coming out of some of the federal courts, but this California model that they've been touting as a form of rehabilitation towards recidivism is an epic failure. In fact, CDCR needs to stop grandstanding behind its misleading pseudonym CDCR and drop the R. Because let's be honest, there is no rehabilitation. And the state system is doing nothing to curb recidivism. Besides, in this messy political windfall that it has helped create, I guess in some sense it would be counterproductive because this is job security at its finest. Nothing else that CDCR is doing right now makes any sense. You know, I'll spare you guys the grief of repeating everything that I said in that video, but for those of you that are really interested and concerned about what's going on in the state system, I advise you guys to go back and watch that video because it touches on some key issues. You know, another channel that puts a lot of this in clear perspective is Hector Bravo's channel, That Prison Guard. In fact, shout out to Hector Bravo, one of the few channels on YouTube who stays out of the YouTube petty drama and who just focuses on putting out good content. And considering the fact that he was once a former lieutenant who worked for CDCR, he offers a unique perspective that differs from those of us who have been through the system, one that we can't give you guys. You know, guys like myself who have been through the system, we can only tell you what we know. But what better way to get a well-rounded perspective than to get the other side of it from someone like him, a former lieutenant. You know, every now and then I'll pull up to his channel for the purpose of looking for two things that he continues to maintain a running count on: the number of homicides that have been committed in 2025, and overall what's going on within the political side of CDCR. You know, as I watched a little bit of Hector's channel, there was a name that I kept hearing him mention that obviously was somebody that was part of CDCR's leadership, Jeff McCumber. And at some point, it became clear that Hector had no love or respect for this guy. And out of curiosity, it made me take a deeper dive into finding out who Jeff McCumber was and what role he played within CDCR. It then all made sense, and I clearly understood why Hector continued to put this guy in a negative light. Jeff McCumber is the acting secretary for CDCR and is basically the one at the top of the chain pushing all the buttons. You know, and I'm sure that there's a lot more people who share some of the accountability for what's happening within the state system. But by definition, Jeff McCumber definitely deserves the brunt of it based on his role as the acting secretary. You know, I'd be willing to bet that there's a lot of you that probably don't give two shits about what the California model is, what it stands for, or what it represents. But just to put it in context for you guys and just for the purpose of this story, I'm going to give you the short version. Just so you guys can get a good laugh and just so you can understand the level of hypocrisy that's involved with some of the bigwigs and the mucky mucks like Jeff McCumber. So the California model is a statewide initiative by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, and the California Correctional Healthcare Services, CCHCS, that's supposed to be focused on one purpose, and that's to transform the state's correctional system by improving things like rehabilitation, public safety, and employee working conditions. It says it emphasizes a holistic approach based on its 4 pillars: normalization, dynamic security, peer mentorship, and trauma-informed organization, whatever that means. Like I said before in some of my other videos, with the exception of a few sporadic programs such as Gogi and Pelican Bay, the California model isn't really based on any real forms of rehabilitation. It's not happening. If it sounds like it's a bunch of bullshit, it's because that's exactly what it is. All it is a bunch of fancy verbiage to make the California model look more attractive. And like I said, it's nothing more than political grandstanding. Normalization, dynamic security, peer mentorship, and trauma-informed organization. Those are the 4 pillars. Where do I even start? I'm not going to spend too much more time on this, but based on a model that's supposed to emphasize taking a holistic approach on a model using these 4 pillars, I just don't understand how long it's going to take for these guys to understand that it's just not working and that they failed at every juncture. So according to Hector's numbers, since Jeff McCumber's been in office since 2022, there's been a total of 86 homicides, and that was as of the other day. There's almost been a homicide daily, so I don't know what the county is now. But those numbers are astronomical in comparison to years like 2011, 2012, or 2013. And if you don't believe me, go look and do the research yourself. The numbers will shock you. And we all know what happened after 2014, or what changed that had a direct impact on those numbers. The main thing that happened were the changes that were made to the indie tournament shoe policies and the release of all the validated gang members back out to the main lines. You can play the piecemeal game and say that 90% of it is happening on the SMY yards if you support the inmates on the GPs, or you can say that 90% of it's happening on the GPs if you support the SMYs. But the bottom line is this, regardless of who you support or what you believe in, the entire system is in shambles. And if CDCR is going to continue to tout itself as a system that's continuing to promote things like rehabilitation, normalization, peer mentorship, dynamic security, or trauma-informed organization, the whole system needs to be overhauled. They have to take corrective action at some point and stop what's happening right now. I'm seriously disappointed that I can't show you guys the video of the homicide that this story is based on. Not because I want the views or because I want to bring that type of attention to the channel, but because everyone needs to see what's going on in there. The only way change is going to be effectuated is by elevating people's awareness and by letting them see what's going on. Make no mistake about it, the media plays a big role in some of the deception that's being propagated to some of its viewers, and I'll tell you why. For the average person that doesn't have access at getting a hold of these types of videos, they're going to continue to believe the propaganda that the media puts out, only because they don't know any better. Now, I'll give you an example relating to this story right here. So in most of the articles that came out about this incident that this story is based on, 90% of those articles reported on this incident in the same context by saying this. Staff immediately responded and issued several verbal commands to stop, all of which were ignored. Staff then deployed multiple less than lethal use of force options, which then immediately quelled the incident. Anybody that reads this is going to draw the conclusion that the victim was attacked by 2 perpetrators who failed to comply with verbal commands to get down. That much is understood. But then in the very next sentence where it says that staff deployed multiple less than lethal use of force options, which ultimately quelled the incident, is going to lead anybody to believe that although these guys initially refused to get down, that eventually after a few more verbal commands, they got down. It almost makes it sound like it happened fast after less than lethal force options were deployed. However, based on this story and what I'm going to describe to you guys are going to get a completely different conclusion, and you're going to see that they allowed this guy to be slaughtered. Now, on that same note, let me be clear about something. I'm not advocating that CDCR start shooting or taking out inmates that are involved in committing this type of violence. It's not my place to do that. But when you have a job to do and you're claiming that you're doing your job, then that's where I have a problem. For me, reporting on a story like this puts me in a unique and uncomfortable position. Because on one hand, I've been to prison and I've been in situations like this. I was one of those inmates that was getting shot at while stabbing somebody. So my opinion is a little bit biased. On the other hand, when it comes to giving you guys true, accurate, unfettered information that hasn't been watered down, I try not to be biased and I try to be as neutral as I possibly can. In the times like this, when I feel the need to play the devil's advocate, I've got to be honest with you guys. When I watched that video, it was probably close to about the 1.5 minute mark when I started asking myself, how come they're not using lethal force? Because it seems like the only time that they use lethal force is when they want to or when they feel it's justified. At other times when they should have used it but didn't for whatever reason, it's also justified. I don't know. I only know what I know about this story. But initially, I actually thought that maybe the tower cop had a personal issue with this guy and that maybe that's why she allowed this guy to get slaughtered. And although there was a lot of people speculating about why this happened, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, what I can tell you is that this guy wasn't no chomo, he wasn't a weirdo, and he had been functioning as a norteño for quite some time. But I'll get back to that in a minute. So unless I'm wrong, I always knew CDCR's policy on lethal force to be as follows. Whenever it was discovered that an inmate was being attacked by another inmate with a deadly weapon and his life was in imminent danger, lethal force from that point on was justified. And this is something that's in accordance with the DOM, the Department of Operations Manual. It's simple. If someone's getting stabbed and attacked by two inmates with weapons, then the gun towers have full discretions to use lethal force to preserve the life of that victim. I'll tell you guys like this, even in Corcoran during the Corcoran shoe wars, we all knew that the gun towers had full discretion to shoot us anytime they wanted. They could justify it under any circumstances. It didn't matter. You could be laying on your back, proned out, get shot, and they would still justify it. And you had to be careful because if you and your cellie ever went out to the yard and only one other guy came out and you both jumped on him, that might be grounds for lethal force. Anytime you used your feet to kick somebody, that was grounds for lethal force because they consider a kick to be a deadly weapon. If you're stomping somebody out, you're gonna get shot. All they have to do is say that they felt like somebody's life was in danger, and that was enough justification right there. But in this case and some of the other videos I have, some of the gun towers will continue to shoot the block gun or administer chemical agents, the non-lethal forms of force, 2 minutes into an assault after somebody's already been stabbed over a dozen times. By then, even if they did use lethal force, the victim would be lucky if he survived, especially considering the type of weapons that they're using nowadays. You should be looking at images of bangers that I was able to find. And even though you can clearly see what they look like in these pictures, trust me, pictures don't do them no justice. I've said this before, but sometimes these things are crafted with so much precision, time, and detail that they're just like the knives that you have right now in your kitchen drawer. And there's a reason why they call these things bone crushers, because they crush bones and they cause a lot of internal damage. And when you have a flat piece of steel like this, you don't have to worry about it bending or breaking either. This is a solid piece of steel, and most of the craftsmanship goes into fashioning the point. That's one of the most critical parts. When done right, it slides in like butter. Believe it or not, the human body is pretty resilient. You'd be surprised at the level of punishment that it can take and recover from. But these kinds of weapons are unforgiving, and when you got two guys that are stabbing a target with weapons like these, it's almost impossible not to take someone's life. That's why you guys are hearing about so many homicides that are taking place in there right now. Anyways, I think I premised this the way that I've kind of wanted to by telling you guys about some of the other factors and elements that are involved. So without further ado, let me tell you guys about some of the details of this story and what happened. So this story is about an incident that took place sometime on or around April 8, 2025 at Salinas Valley State Prison. So several months before this incident occurred, Joseph Little Man Mendoza, Edgar Grinch Frere, and Nicholas Chato Young were all moved to C Yard from B Yard. Little Man got caught with a weapon and some black, so after spending a few months in ADSEG, eventually he was kicked out and rehoused on C Yard. So Chato and Grinch were both involved in the simultaneous stabbings of Baby Joker from Watsonville and Demon from Salinas that occurred on B Yard on April 10th, 2019. I'll be covering that story after this story. I've got a lot more inside details for you guys, details that I wasn't aware of until recently, so I'll be covering that story soon as well. Anyways, again, after spending some time in ADSEG and getting moved around, Chato and Grinch were also rehoused and moved to C Yard. And coincidentally, Little Man, Chato, and Grinch all landed in Building 1 together. So just to keep this in context, the difference between B Yard and C Yard is that B Yard is the 270 design and C Yard is a more restricted 180 design. So for those of you that don't know what this means, let me try to put this in perspective for you. So a 180 design basically allows the officer in the gun tower to get a full 180-degree unobstructed view of all the cells in the day room around them. On the flip side, in contrast, a 270 design has cells that are arranged in a wider arc, with portions of the housing extending behind the blind side of the gun tower, limiting direct observation from a single vantage point. That's the best way I can explain it. So Little Man, the individual that ended up being the victim in this story, is described as someone who basically just minded his own business and did his own program. From all accounts, he was described as being quiet and somewhat timid. And the other interesting thing about him is that he was from Fresno. So after being subjected to an extensive screening process, as so many other guys from Fresno usually are, it was determined that he had no affiliations with the F-14ers or the Bulldogs, and he was allowed to program as a Norteño. So I'm not sure how long Little Man had already been down for at that point, but from everything I've been able to gather, he had already been down for a good minute. And after he landed on C Yard, at some point, he was able to slide into one of the best jobs on that yard, the C Yard visiting room porter. You know, I'm not sure exactly how he was able to land that job, but that's a job that comes with a lot of perks. And it's usually a job that's strongly competed for. I mean, it's a kickback job. The job itself consists of sweeping and mopping the floors, wiping down the windows and phones, emptying the garbage, just keeping the visiting room clean. I mean, there's other minor things that you have to do when you're out there, but for the most part, it's a kickback job. And just the fact that you get to go out to the visiting room and be around civilians and get away from that yard environment, that in itself is a privilege. But the real perks come from you being able to bring clavo in back from the visiting room that was inconspicuously stashed by the visitors. They'll usually try to bring it in themselves because this shortcuts all the drama. They don't have to worry about somebody tampering with their package. They don't have to worry about somebody losing their package because of their stupidity. And they don't have to worry about paying somebody else on top of what you already owe the casa. But they got cameras out there in the visiting room, and a lot of the times if you're trying to keister something, they'll catch it. So I could see why some people might not want to take those chances. But again, that kind of job would be ideal for someone who didn't have a hustle, or who didn't have a lot of personal resources, or who just didn't have family that was able to help them out financially. They could obviously get their hustle on by muling in some of the D from the visiting room and taking care of themselves by the cut they would receive from bringing it in. So again, this job could be beneficial to someone who needed financial assistance. But on the flip side, it could also be detrimental as well, especially considering the way that politics are being pushed by individuals who have proven themselves to be tyrants. And I'm not speaking from my own personal perspective because I obviously wasn't there. I'm simply repeating things that were told to me by individuals who were there on the yard when all this was happening. Trip on this, Cornell from Sacra was so paranoid about contraband or communications infiltrated in the yard from the federal faction that he had a squad of 3N souls greet any new Norteños that landed on that yard and then proceed to take them through a vigorous screening process. So these 3N souls would escort this new arrival to a cell where they make them strip out and check them for any contraband, paperwork, clavo, or weapons. This would also include an interrogation to see if they could sense or determine any outside loyalties that might have been attributed to the federal faction. You know, one thing that you guys need to keep in mind is that the NF had their hands in anything and everything that they possibly could in Salinas Valley. I'm talking about everything from flipping COs to having all the plugs and resources to locking down all the management jobs. They had their hands in everything. And I guess you could say with Salinas Valley being right there in their backyard, rightfully so. You know, if you guys remember, T Money was the NF member that was accused of running up to his cell while Norteño was getting moved on in the day room. I believe this is the same incident where there was also speculation about Silencio getting locked into one of the showers. But who runs to their cell and changes their shoes when something like this happens? Time out. I'm gonna go change my Jordans, throw on my state boots. I'll be right back. Under any other circumstances, I guarantee you this would have been grounds for removal, as it would have been considered to be an act of cowardice. If he wouldn't have been in a position to generate the kind of money that he was for Silencio and sleepers, he would have been done. But these were just a few of the areas on C Yard that they had locked down, and each one of them came with its own set of advantages. You know, keep in mind that there's a lot more involved when it comes to establishing a yard than just weaponry, security, leadership, and a strong unified front. Controlling some of the better jobs, which provides you with some solid resources, is a key component as well. And this is something that the NF understood. So aside from T Money and several others working in management jobs in the kitchen, you had sleepers in the canteen, Little Man in the visiting room, and then you had Andrew Leck, Chino from Salinas, who worked in the program office. They had a lot of the other basic jobs, such as the building porters and the yard crew locked down as well. But it was the clerical jobs that enabled them to gather some of the critical information and establish a level of influence that was priceless. So for those of you that don't know what the program office is, it's basically where the administration works. It's where the lieutenants, sergeants, and captains work. And when you have people working in there in the program office, working clerical jobs, they have unfettered access at gathering all kinds of information. All the paperwork that gets generated, the 114 lockup orders, the RVRs or the 115s and things like that. You know, a lot of the time, if you got somebody working in the program office, all they got to do is keep their mouth shut and put their ear to the ground. The information is going to come to them. All they got to do is listen. Because most of the time, all the cops do is sit in there and talk. They talk about all the sensitive things that pertain to that yard. And Chino ain't no dummy. He's a well-rounded norteño. He's got a brother doing time in the federal system. This is a picture of his brother Anthony Leck with Gabe G Money Garacheo from Salinas. You know, like I told you guys in the earlier part of the story, if not next, sometime soon, I'm going to be running the story on how Baby Joker and Leo Quintos, Demon from Salinas, were both moved on simultaneously on B Yard. It's going to include exclusive, never-before-seen pictures of everyone that was involved. A lot of the NF members that were there at one time have since been transferred out or were indicted in Operation Quiet Storm. When they were all there, it consisted of the following: James Conejo Perez, Steven Esteban Trujillo, Antonio Chuco Guillen, Bobby Silencio Lopez, Marco Flaco Tapete, Victor Sleepers Escabel, Nico Vasquez, Trinidad Trino Martinez, Guillermo Capone Solario, Jerry Chino Lord, Oscar Baby Joker Cabrera, Anthony Tigre Rubalcaba, Albert Smiley-On Martinez. For those of you that knew Smiley-On, he was moved on and taken out by these two individuals in High Desert about 3 or 4 years ago. Dwayne Joe Jeff Jefferson, Patrick Chino Smith, Paul Smiley Lopez, and Candido Gato Loera. The only NF members that are left on BR presently today are Silencio, Sleepers, and Flaco. So when the Baby Joker Demon incident took place, there was a lot of Mexican Mafia members that were on that yard as well. You had Richie Buchanan, Johnny Crow Martinez, Carlos Gabby Arciniega, Hector Ayala, who's condemned, Lorenzo Lencho Arias, who's also condemned, and Henry Indio Carlos. Buchanan, Martinez, and Arciniega were all transferred out. Crow Martinez was indicted and picked up by the feds. Gabby ended up getting transferred to Ironwood, and then for whatever reason, he ended up locking it up. So just recently, he was transferred to Corcoran, where the 2-5ers supposedly moved on him and beat him up pretty bad. Currently, the only Mexican Mafia members that are left on BR today are Hector Ayala and Henry Indio Carlos. Lencho Arias got sent to C Yard for being in possession of a weapon when he was on B Yard. Anyways, getting back to Little Man and this visiting room porter job that he had on C Yard. What could have been a good financial opportunity for him ended up becoming one of the worst things that could have ever happened to him. Because the NF took away his hustle and basically turned it into a situation where he was being strong-armed and mandated into conforming to policies that only benefited them. You know, I'm sure at some point it was no longer a job that offered Little Man financial opportunities, and instead it turned into a dreaded responsibility where he felt like he was being punked. But it would only end up getting worse from there, because for whatever reason, the NF eventually started accusing Little Man of tampering with their packages. And you know, who knows, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But from everything I've been able to gather, Little Man wasn't no dummy. And I don't think he would have continued to do that if he knew he was under scrutiny. Especially when it got to the point where they started warning him and threatening him that if he continued, they were going to move on him. You know, I'm not sure what made them think that Little Man was tampering with their packages, but from what I was told, they were getting so much D on that yard and they had so many resources that they actually had triple beam scales on that yard. It sounds crazy, but I've been in situations where I was able to get some crazy contraband in as well, and I believe it. So maybe they were weighing it and found out that way, or maybe they were having their packages booby-trapped, which isn't unusual at all. What I mean by booby-trapped is this: whoever wraps the packages up will either put a certain amount of knots in it or will tie it up in a distinctive way that only they would know about. And that information is then relayed to their contacts behind the walls. So if those knots end up being broken or the distinctive way that it's wrapped is undone, then they obviously know that it's been tampered with. Either way, Little Man was apparently warned several times, and for whatever reason, the house felt like he never stopped. Stealing from the NF or the Mexican Mafia is an automatic death sentence, and it's something that's taken very serious, especially when it's done consistently or done by someone who thinks they're just that slick or who continues to do it defiantly. So I guess it got to the point where a decision was made to take Little Man out for his blatant indiscretions, and a green light was sanctioned. Now, as I had mentioned to you guys, Chato was involved in stabbing Baby Joker, and Grinch was involved in stabbing Demon. And obviously, they both survived. The point I'm trying to make is this. I don't know if this had any bearing on whether or not they were selected to participate in Little Man's demise, but I guess it's possible. Nonetheless, both of these two were considered to have frontline status, and they're both lifers. So maybe it was just a matter of chance, opportunity, or them raising their hands. Because remember, Little Man, Grinch, and Chato were all housed in Building 1 together. In fact, Chato and Grinch were both cellies. Now, I obviously can't show you guys the video, but I'm gonna walk you guys through it step by step so that you can get the visuals. One thing that I will say before I describe this video is that it's extremely graphic. I've seen several before in the past, but this one right here is probably one of the worst. So the entire length of the video is 2 minutes and 2 seconds long. And during that entire time, they're both butchering this guy. There comes a point when you can actually see when Little Man loses his life, and I'll detail that as it's happening. But there's one other disclaimer that I want to say before I get to this video. With all due respect to Little Man's family and friends, if you guys are watching this, you probably want to skip through this part of the video. And I say this with an abundance of respect, because although I understand that there's obviously family and friends who have grieved over his loss, I think this story needs to be given attention for 2 reasons. One is in the form of a wake-up call for all those youngsters who continue to glorify prison and what happens behind the walls. I wish YouTube would let me play the video for this reason, because I honestly believe that it would be a deterrent and an eye-opener for some of those youngsters that still think prison is a cool place to go. But secondly, more attention needs to be given to this story and others like it, because CDCR clearly failed this guy and they need to be exposed for it. And I know I've said it several times already, but they clearly let this guy get slaughtered. And again, I'm not advocating for lethal force. All I'm saying is that according to their own policies, rules, and regulations, they're the ones that dropped the ball. You know, I showed this video to several people who you would consider to be civilians, people that had never been to prison. And they all asked the same question. Why didn't they shoot these guys when all attempts to use non-lethal force failed? You know, you guys are gonna draw your own conclusions based on the descriptions that I'm gonna give you. I took some still shots that I'm gonna take a chance and show you guys. I obviously blurred out Little Man's body, but hopefully these pictures will help you get some of the visuals. So just to premise this video, let me kind of set the stage for you guys. So this incident happened in Building 1's day room, in full view of all the other inmates that were out in the day room programming. I don't know how they managed to coordinate it like this, but all the guys that you see in the backdrop, they're all either Norteños or they're Sureños. There's no white guys out there, there's no Africanos. You can actually see them in some of the still shots that I'm going to show you guys. They're all congregated in the back by the stairs. So anyways, the video starts out where you can see Chato, Little Man, and Grinch in the far left-hand corner of the building, and the stabbing's already in motion. It doesn't show how or when it started, but it's obvious that they just started hitting him based on the fact that Little Man doesn't have that much blood on him. So Chato's shirtless, wearing some 3/4 length blue state issue pants and some white tennis shoes. Grinch is wearing a gray 3/4 sleeve sweatshirt, the same kind of 3/4 length blue state issue pants and some white tennis shoes. And Little Man's wearing a gray sweatshirt, some full length blue state issue pants and some black tennis shoes. So all 3 of them are tussling, and you can see Chato and Grinch stabbing them in the back and in the stomach, and they're holding on to him so he can't get away. Little Man actually falls down on his knees a couple of times, but regains his footing and gets back up. He's not yelling or saying anything, but what you can hear is somebody yelling in the background, probably from behind their cell door. And whoever it is urging Chato and Grinch to keep going, to keep fucking them up. And this is actually something that you can hear throughout the course of the entire video. And this doesn't just sound like someone cheerleading. It's almost being said with a level of authority, as if it's coming from someone with some status. You know, the other thing that you can see in the beginning of the video is either 3 or 4 Norteños or Sureños that are walking by trying to get away from that area. They eventually congregate in the back by the stairs with everyone else who's just standing there watching. But they all had that telltale look on their face when something like this happens in prison. Whenever someone's getting moved on, whether it's in a building or on a yard, you can see the other inmates with this doltish look on their face, almost like it's none of my business, I don't know what's going on, and they're just trying to get away from the crime scene. No disrespect to anyone in the video, but it's almost like everyone starts playing dumb. And the funny thing about it is if you watch a video like this, you can see the other inmates in the background looking everywhere else around them except right there in that area where the stabbing is happening. And this is something that you just learn in prison. It's a form of respect. When someone's getting moved on, you understand that this is what happens in prison and it's part of the lifestyle. But at the same time, you also understand that it's not your business and you look the other way. So as the video continues, at one point, Grinch is standing in front of Little Man and Chato's standing behind him. And although they're both stabbing him, the thing that becomes evident is that they're picking their shots, trying to stab him in the areas where his vital organs are. The heart, the kidneys, the lungs, the liver, the spleen, etc., etc. Both of them are inflicting major damage, as you can now see the blood starting to soak through Little Man's sweatshirt in different areas. But Chato's the most aggressive. You can see him behind Little Man stabbing him in the back, but he's using both of his hands to grip the weapon. And the reason why you do this is obviously to put more power into it, to sink the weapon in deeper. So at this point, this is when it starts to get bad. As Chato continues to stab Little Man in the back using both hands, the three of them start spinning in a circle due to the fact that Little Man was trying to get away from the damage that Chato was inflicting on his back. As they start spinning in a circle, you can see Little Man lift both of his shoulders, wincing in pain every time Chato would hit him. The same kind of reaction anyone would get if someone was stabbing you in the back. So by this time, there's pools of blood all over the floor, and this actually causes Little Man to slip and fall in it. And when Little Man goes down, Chato grabs him by one of his legs and he drags him to a clean spot on the floor because they were all slipping in his blood. Then Chato gets on his back and he straddles him. And again, with both hands, he starts stabbing him in the back. And he looks like he's stabbing him in the area that's right over his heart. So by now, they're all covered with blood. And it's at this point that you can hear the voice of a female gun officer yelling for them to get down on the ground. Obviously, they don't pay attention to her. They continue to do what they're doing, and she's completely ignored. So it's at this point when they ignore her that you can see the smoke from the 37mm block gun that she fires for the first time. The block gun is also known as Big Bertha or the knee knocker. I think you can even see the smoke in one of my still shots. The other thing that you can see is the blocks hitting the ground by them, but this doesn't even faze them. When your adrenaline is flowing and you're turned up like that, you can get hit with the block gun at point blank range and you're probably gonna feel it, but it's not gonna be that bad. I used to get hit like that all the time in Corcoran Shoe, and I wouldn't even know until the next day when I seen the bruise. So while all this is happening, there's two other things that you can hear in the video. You can actually hear Little Man moan from the pain he was in from being stabbed, and it's a weird moan. It's almost like a death rattle. And then you can hear whoever this individual who's behind his door yelling say, "Hit him in his neck, hit him in his fucking neck." So at this point, Little Man sustained a lot of damage, and ever since he slipped in his blood, he hasn't gotten back up off the floor. And even if he tried to, he wouldn't have been able to go anywhere because they stayed on him and they had him pinned down. Meanwhile, the female officer in the gun tower is still yelling, continuing to tell these guys to get out on the ground. And it's at this point that she deploys other non-lethal methods to stop this assault. She takes one of those big canisters of OC pepper spray, a super soaker, and she sprays all three of them, and she saturates them. So all three of them got OC pepper spray on them. But needless to say, this doesn't stop them. And this is where Little Man's family has grounds to go after CDCR with a lawsuit, because I found out that that female officer that was working in the gun tower was brand new and should have never been working in the gun tower. Not on a level 4 180 yard. She was definitely out of her element. You know, anyone that was watching this video by now could definitely see that this guy was being butchered and that the gunner was useless. You know, honestly, he had sustained so much damage at that point that even if she did use lethal force, I don't think he would have survived. I believe that he was already mortally wounded. But the assault continued, and all she did was continue to yell for these guys to get down on the ground. You hear her yell a couple more times, and then she fires off the 37mm block gun a second time. So Chato and Grinch, they both shift their positions, and now they're both on their knees, and they're double gripping their weapons, and they're both stabbing them. One's on either side of them. It's kind of hard to see Little Man because Grinch is in front of him and he's blocking him from that position. But whatever happened, Little Man must have moved because Chato lays down behind him and proceeds to put him in a headlock. And it's at this point that Grinch does most of his damage. You can see him stabbing Little Man everywhere. And again, he's picking his shots. He's not just stabbing Little Man all crazy. He's going for some of the vital areas. But I remember watching the video and thinking to myself, this was almost like when Grinch was getting blood on his hands and became complicit in the homicide. The same type of concept where two individuals go to whack somebody, and after the first guy dumps on him, he hands the gun to the second guy, and then he dumps on him as well. This ensures that they're both involved, they both got blood on their hands, and it's a form of insurance. But that's what I remember thinking when I seen Grinch put his work in. So this guy that you can hear yelling from behind his door, he starts yelling out, "Get that motherfucker, stab him in the head, get him in his neck, get that motherfucker, fuck him up." You know, if I didn't know any better, and based on the level of hate that these guys demonstrated in this video, if I didn't know the backstory on this, I would assume that Little Man must have either been a chomo or he did something really bad to deserve what he was getting. And although I'm well aware of the fact that stealing from the NF or the Mexican Mafia is a very serious allegation that will warrant something like this, I still think that this was over the top. So after Grinch stabs Little Man about another dozen times, I'm thinking that Little Man's body was probably in shock because he looked like he didn't have any more fight left in him. And at this point, all three of them are covered in his blood. Chato was laying in it, so it was all over his back and shoulder, all over his arms. And both Chato and Grinch, remember, they had on white shoes. They were both covered in blood. So here's where it gets about as bad as it's gonna get. Chato releases Little Man out of the headlock, and he gets up on his knees and he starts stabbing him in the face. You can see him stabbing him real fast in downward motions all over his face. This part is graphic, and like I said, you can clearly see it. His face is now covered with blood. So it's almost at this point where you can see that Little Man loses his life, because what Chato does next basically makes sure that he's gone. Even though Little Man's covered in blood and he's weak, he's still moving. So you can tell he's still alive. But like I said, Chato gets up on his knees and he's now leaning over. And you can see Chato take the tip of the weapon, put it over his left eye, and then he sinks the weapon into his eye and he twists. Then he stands up and stomps on the weapon to make sure that it goes deeper into his brain. You know, I personally think that this was done for effect, but whether it was done for effect or to just complete the mission, this guy is definitely a killer. At any rate, when Chato does this, you can see Little Man's body go limp and his arms fall to his sides. So like I said, after Chato stands up and stomps the handle of the weapon deeper into his eye, he gets up and he starts walking around in the day room, obviously pumped up about what he had just done, and because he's covered in blood. I remember the first time I seen this video thinking to myself, this reminds me of the Troy Kill homicide in a documentary called Gladiator Days. If you guys haven't seen it, go check it out. It's a good video. In that video, a similar prison-style homicide takes place in a Nevada state prison. And after Troy Kill, who's a condemned inmate in Nevada, and his partner, Butcher, another inmate named Lonnie Blockman, Troy takes a couple of victory laps around the pod like Chato did, all pumped up because of what he just did. So that's basically the extent of the entire video, and that's about as descriptive as I could possibly get. You know, in the last couple of seconds of the video, you can barely see Grinch in the bottom left-hand corner, covered in blood, and it takes him a minute to get back up. You know, when I first watched the video, I didn't know if he was winded, if maybe he got dazed by the block gun, or if maybe Chato inadvertently stabbed him on an accident. But it almost looks like he's hurt. Trust me, when there's two of you and you're stabbing someone like that and you're both tired, it's pretty common to get stabbed by accident. But I don't know either way. Right after that, the video ends. So since I started putting this story in context and I started doing my research so I could drop it, there's been a few updates. I'm not pointing my finger at anyone, and it's not something I'm even upset about. But I sent that video out to a couple of people just so that they could check it out. And unfortunately, it got disseminated all over social media. I seen it on IG and I seen it on other social media platforms. You know, on one hand, I know better and it's my fault because I should have waited until I put the story out first. But on the other hand, I'm kind of glad that some of you might have had a chance to see the video, because now that you're hearing this story, I'm able to put it in context for you. So like I said, I seen it on IG and I seen it on a couple other social media platforms. But one of the first things that I did was go straight to the comments to see what some of you thought about it. And sure enough, there was a lot of people speculating about whether or not Little Man was a chomo, or that he must have done something really bad to deserve what he got. But again, I can tell you for a fact that he wasn't a chomo and that he had been programming as an active Norteño for quite some time. Somebody else speculated that it probably had something to do with money, which it was, but they assumed that it had something to do with taxes and the former leadership that got indicted in Operation Quiet Storm. And that wasn't the case. The other thing that I noticed about a lot of the comments is that 90% of them asked the same question that a lot of the people that I showed the video to asked me as well. How come they didn't use lethal force? And then there were others who, after seeing the level of violence that was depicted in this video, took more of a cynical approach by saying these guys should have been put down on the spot. Anyways, in closing, I just want to leave you guys with a few quick thoughts. So it's a well-proven fact that prison is a very violent and treacherous environment. We all know this. And violence is the moving force. It's just part of that belief system. And considering the fact that you're surrounded by a bunch of other individuals who are just as violent, and I honestly believe that this is the reason why there's so many people that are intrigued and captivated by what happens behind the walls. You know, something that's becoming more and more clear is that the NF and its following have designated Salinas Valley State Prison as its killing grounds. The same way the Mexican Mafia has laid claim to places like Calipatria and Santanella. You know, and having done a lot of time in the system and seeing some of the things that I've seen in prison, my perspective on violence is a little different from that of somebody who has never been to prison or somebody that would consider themselves to be a civilian. Unfortunately, because of the dynamics of what happens behind the walls, violence is a necessary part of that existence. But even with my perspective being somewhat skewed, I can honestly say that what's happening right now is shameful. I've talked to quite a few individuals from my era who did time back in the 80s and 90s, and they all said the same thing. That it's hard to watch these guys tear down everything that we built back in those years, and that it's all being done behind greed and financial gain. Some of the same things the Norteño spirit was built on. The NR, the Nuestra Raza, was founded on the same philosophy. At one point in time, it was the guiding light that advocated against everything that it has now become today. It used to be about educating, bettering, and teaching some of these youngsters that they could do something positive with their lives, to stay out of prison. Education was something that we pushed hard. Staying out of prison was something else that we tried to instill within these youngsters. We used to tell them, you're no good to us as long as you're locked up in here with us. Go out there on the streets and make something out of your life. When they failed, we showed them the right way and we took steps towards corrective action. But that's because there was genuine carnalismo. We cared about each other's well-being. But all that's gone now. The mindset has completely changed. And now, instead of nurturing them and showing them a better way, it's all about spilling their blood and getting rid of them. Unfortunately, from the way things are looking, it's only going to continue to get worse, and I doubt things will ever go back to being the way that they used to be. Financial gain and power corrupts everything it touches, be it corporate or criminal. And when you look at everything that's happened behind the walls over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, it's obvious that even some of these criminal organizations aren't exempt from this either. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you for continuing to show your unwavering loyalty and for just continuing to tap into the channel. With that being said, you guys keep pushing that positivity and enjoy the rest of your day. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.